For centuries, armies tried to solve the weakness of the human body with chemistry. A drink before battle, a pill before a mission, a drug to numb fear or fight exhaustion. But did these drugs actually work as intended, or did it create new problems? One of the most repeated examples is the Viking berserker. The term refers to a specific type of warrior described in later Norse sources. Men said to fight in a state of extreme fury, beyond ordinary fear and pain. For years, people have suggested that this fury may have been caused by drugs. The most popular version claims they ate fly agaric mushrooms before battle. More recently, some researchers have suggested henbane may fit the reported symptoms better. But both ideas remain speculative. There is no contemporary source describing a reliable drug practice for berserkers. What survives comes from later Norse sagas, shaped by memory, myth, and interpretation. The berserker story does not prove that some Vikings fall under the influence of drugs. It shows something else. When warriors appear too fearless or violent to explain easily, people often look for chemical answers. The same caution applies to other pre-modern examples. In Mesoamerica, psychoactive plants were used in religious and ritual settings. Among the Scythians, ancient Greek writers described the inhalation of hemp vapors in ceremonial context. These practices matter, but they do not prove that soldiers were routinely drugged for battle. Many cultures use intoxicants. Some connected altered states of mind with power, endurance, or the supernatural. But direct evidence of organized battlefield drug use is limited. The clearer story begins with industrial war. By the early 20th century, armies had become larger, weapons more destructive, and campaigns more demanding. Soldiers were expected to march further, stay awake longer, and endure heavier bombardments, and keep functioning under conditions that pushed the limits of the human body. War was no longer only a test of courage or discipline, it had become a problem of endurance, management, and survival. In that environment, drugs became more than symbols or rituals, they became tools. The First World War marked one of the major turning points. Millions of men were placed in trenches defined by mud, cold, artillery fire, disease, rats, gas, and psychological strain. The war also came at a time when modern drug regulation was still developing. Substances that would later be tightly controlled were still widely available. Alcohol was the most familiar. British soldiers on the Western Front were commonly issued rum under controlled conditions, especially before attacks, during extreme weather, or after traumatic experiences. It was meant to steady nerves, maintain morale, and give men a sense that something was being done for them before they were sent back into danger. It created a sense of warmth, though it did not truly protect the body from the cold. Cocaine also appeared in the medical and commercial world of the period. Some products were promoted for stamina and fatigue. Forced march was one example, marketed as a stimulant for exhausted men, but concern about misuse grew during the war. In Britain, wartime regulations restricted access to substances such as cocaine and opium, partly because officials feared their spread among the soldiers. The First World War did not create the link between drugs and combat, it made that link more systematic. The soldier became part of an industrial process, stabilized, numbed, stimulated, patched up, and sent back to the line. Drugs could reduce pain, steady nerves, or help a man continue when his body wanted to stop. They could also create new risks. The next war pushed those risks even further. The Second World War was faster, wider, and more mobile. Combat was no longer dominated by static trench lines. Armies fought with tanks, aircraft, motorized columns, submarines, and long-range bombing campaigns. Speed mattered, surprise mattered, night operations mattered, and fatigue became a strategic problem. A pilot who lost focus, a driver who fell asleep, or a tank crew that stopped too soon could endanger an entire mission. In this context, stimulants became more important. In Germany, one of the most widely used was Pervitin, a methamphetamine-based stimulant. It was distributed to soldiers to reduce fatigue and increase wakefulness, especially during operations where rest was limited. It helped troops remain awake for long periods and maintain the pace demanded by mechanized warfare. Pervitin became closely associated with early German blitzkrieg campaigns. German success depended on surprise, concentrated force, communication, air support, and combined arms tactics. The drug supported endurance inside that system. Its appeal was obvious. It allowed soldiers to stay awake longer, drivers to keep vehicles moving, and units to push forward when exhaustion should have slowed them down. But the danger was just as clear. A drug that extended performance could also distort judgment, encourage overconfidence, and push the body beyond safe limits. Germany was not alone. Britain, the United States, and Japan all faced the same problem: how to keep men alert in a war that demanded more alertness than the human body could reliably provide. In Britain, the Royal Air Force initially prohibited amphetamine use. By 1942, it approved benzodrine for certain operations. Aircrews flying long missions, often at night, face extreme fatigue. Commanders and medical officers had to weigh two risks against each other: the danger of exhaustion and the danger of chemical stimulation. The United States also adopted amphetamines during the war, issuing them in controlled ways to pilots and other personnel. Japan distributed methamphetamine, known as Hirapon, to military personnel in roles required to sustain alertness. One of the most striking cases comes from Finland. Emo Koivunen was a Finnish soldier during the Continuation War against the Soviet Union. In March 1944, he was part of a ski patrol operating in harsh winter conditions. The patrol came under pressure from Soviet forces and had to escape through deep snow while exhausted and exposed. In that moment, staying awake and moving was not just difficult, it was a matter of survival. Koivunen was carrying the patrol's supply of Pervitin tablets. Under extreme stress, he consumed the entire supply, around 30 tablets, at once. At first, the drug gave him energy. Then it took control away from him. He became disorientated, lost contact with his unit, and eventually blacked out. When he regained awareness, he was alone in hostile territory, separated from his patrol, and without proper supplies. What followed became one of the strangest survival stories of the war. Koivunen continued moving through the frozen wilderness, avoided Soviet forces, was injured by a landmine, and survived with almost nothing to eat. By the time he was found, he had traveled hundreds of kilometers, his body weight had dropped drastically, and his heart rate was dangerously high. Koivunen survived, but his story is not just a bizarre wartime anecdote. It shows a central contradiction of military stimulant use. The drug may have kept him moving, but it also helped separate him from his unit, his judgment, and his own control. It extended endurance at a severe cost. By the end of the Second World War, the basic pattern was clear. Drugs could help soldiers stay awake, reduce fatigue, and continue operating under extreme pressure. They could support pilots, drivers, infantrymen, and crews facing conditions that exceeded normal human limits. But it could also lead to dependency, collapse, impaired decisions, and psychological strain. After 1945, militaries did not abandon the idea of chemically managed soldiers. They refined it. Cold War armies studied fatigue, fear, alertness, pain, and performance with increased seriousness. Drugs became part of a wider technical approach to the human body in war. But the next major public reckoning did not come from official stimulant programs. It came from Vietnam. Vietnam changed the story because the pattern shifted. In the First and Second World Wars, the most famous examples often involved drugs issued, tolerated, or managed by military authorities. In Vietnam, drug use became part of a wider environment shaped by stress, availability, boredom, fear, and collapsing morale. American soldiers in Vietnam faced a war with no stable front line and no clear measure of progress. Combat could mean patrols, ambushes, mines, jungle fighting, sudden violence, and long periods of waiting. Many soldiers were young, many were conscripts, many served in a war whose purpose seemed increasingly unclear, especially as opposition grew at home. This environment mattered. Marijuana was widely used, alcohol remained common, amphetamines were present, but heroin became the symbol of the crisis. Especially by the early 1970s, it was cheap, available, and often highly pure. Reports of heroin use among American troops alarmed the military and the public. The fear was not only that soldiers were using drugs in Vietnam, the fear was that large numbers of addicted veterans would return to the United States and carry the war's damages home with them. Research led by Lee Robbins examined this fear in detail. Studies of American enlisted men found that many had used opioids in Vietnam, and a significant minority had developed dependence while there. But the follow-up results surprised many people. A large number of soldiers who used heroin in Vietnam did not remain addicted after returning home. Months after leaving the war zone, only a relatively small percentage still showed signs of opiate dependence. This did not mean the crisis was harmless. Some veterans continued to struggle with addiction. Others carried trauma, injury, and psychological damage long after the war ended. But the findings complicated the story. They showed that environment was crucial. Vietnam was not just a place where drugs were available. It was a place of fear, isolation, boredom, moral confusion, and stress. For many soldiers, drug use was tied to the conditions of the war itself. When they returned home, those conditions changed. Access changed, daily routine changed, social pressure changed. The meaning of the drug use completely changed. Addiction in war is never simple. Drug use cannot be reduced to weakness, bad discipline, or personal failure. It is shaped by orders, fear, pain, support, exhaustion, and whether the mission feels meaningful. Vietnam exposed the limits of the old military dream of chemically making soldiers braver, calmer, stronger, or less tired. Drugs could still keep pilots awake, numb pain, or push men forward, but they cannot solve the war's deeper problems. Modern militaries still use stimulants in controlled settings, mainly to manage fatigue, not create fearless warriors. Across history, drugs can extend human limits, but never truly erase those limits.